Secretary, thanks for giving me the opportunity to speak on this. Unfortunately, we learned about this the hard way in 2011, so it's critical we outline a secure plan to ensure its success. R2P emerged because the world watched Rwanda and did too little and felt bad, and then the world watched Kosovo and just couldn't agree on what legitimate international action should have looked like. So we took away that state sovereignty does imply some international humanitarian responsibility and that it's not a shield. Every state has the responsibility to protect its population from genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity. If a state is manifestly failing, the international community can act, but only on a case-by-case basis through the Security Council. But they must use peaceful means first, and they can only use coercive tactics if those peaceful means fail. R2P became strong as a brand, but weak as a norm because in practice, it's usually invoked as a principle, but it's rarely enforced as a consistent rule because it still boils down to the Security Council and whether major powers are willing to put human security above realpolitik. With that in mind, we should discuss Libya. Even though it looked like a breakthrough at the start, I would argue Libya was not a successful application of R2P. What worked at first though is important. The Security Council unanimously passed Resolution 1970, which condemned gross and systematic violations of human rights and recognized what were referred to as attacks that may constitute crimes against humanity, so they imposed an arms embargo and sanctions. That is R2P functioning in its least controversial form. They named the risk, it isolated perpetrators, and prioritized accountability. That's what it's supposed to do in its purest form, but why wasn't it successful? Well, success under R2P isn't just stopping the immediate killing, it's protecting populations in a way that strengthens the norm and reduces future atrocity risk. Libya became a case where the intervention was widely perceived as sliding from civilian protection into regime change. The world began to ask whether the operation was to protect or depose, and NATO arguably failed that test because it was seen as going far beyond just protecting civilians and became aimed at getting rid of the Libyan ruler. And the consequences were not abstract. After Gaddafi's fall, Libya did not consolidate into a stable order that protected civilians. It fractured into militia rule with repeated violations of international human rights law. There were abductions, tortures, extrajudicial killings, and later even civil war dynamics. In other words, even if the operation prevented an imminent massacre in the short term, the long term outcome undermined the claim that R2P sustainably produces protection. So Libya demonstrated that R2P can be successfully enacted and produce some relief for desperate populations, but it also showed how easily legitimacy collapses if the mission appears to exceed its protective mandate or if there is no credible post-conflict protection plan. In theory, Libya looked like the moment R2P arrived, but it looked great that the Security Council authorized such a drastic measure to protect civilians and to use force in doing so. But in practice, Libya weakened trust. That's exactly the strong brand, weak norm problem. R2P is still theoretically powerful, but we see inconsistent support. The Security Council frequently reaffirms that states bear their primary responsibility, but action is usually peacekeeping mandates and accountability language, not consistent enforcement. Now, in the case of Erehwon, it echoes Libya in 2011 quite a bit, but it also has more fragile complications for the US because the government has Moscow ties and China infrastructure stakes, and rebels are very openly anti-Western and aim to build an Islamic state. That means if we repeat what happened in Libya, fast action with an ambiguous political end state, we will likely lose legitimacy and coalition support very quickly. So we need to be very smart here. The goal should be to protect Jamalis from imminent mass atrocity while minimizing regime change and maximizing international legitimacy. Here's what I recommend. First, precisely define the threat. We should publicly frame this as an imminent risk of human rights crimes, specifically crimes against humanity and ethnic cleansing. Given the president's vow to expel or kill all Jamalis and the airstrike killing nearly 200 civilians in a displaced persons camp, these are core elements that we need to recognize to push R2P. But we have to avoid overpromising with labels. If we call it genocide prematurely, we create pressure to escalate without necessarily having the capacity or support to sustain action. Second, we need to move first on the elements of R2P that are hardest to oppose. So before force, we press for an emergency Security Council session that demands a ceasefire around Jamal. And second, we We press for targeted sanctions against leaders ordering attacks and an arms embargo, just like what worked in Libya. These steps protect civilians directly and they build legitimacy for stronger action if the Erehwon government continues using force. Third, we need to secure regional legitimacy early, not as an afterthought. Then, if force becomes necessary, we design it as population protection, not regime change. What's important here is the message. We need to be honest. The US has limited direct interest in Erewhon. That's not a weakness. It's what our stance is credible. It's why our stance is credible and values driven. There are a few obstacles to consider here. The Security Council veto politics, rebel character, and once force begins, pressure will grow to finish the job. Secretary, my bottom line is this. Erewhon is exactly the kind of atrocity risk case R2P was designed for, but Libya shows that legitimacy is fragile. If we intervene, we must do it with a mandate that is precise, transparent, regionally backed, and paired with accountability. Otherwise, we might stop one massacre and still leave behind a more fragile position and a longer war repeating the Libya pattern we can't afford to replicate. Thank you.